not just for working on your business. That's the class side of things. But a lot of these discussions revolve around things that are important to real life as well. So we are capstoning this entire experience, talking about managing stress and anxiety in an uncertain world. And today we are joined by two amazing professionals, Mr. Ralph Campbell. If you will, Mr. Campbell, introduce yourself, where you are, what you do, and favorite and least favorite classes in high school, please.
Well, thank you for having me, Julia and Daniel. And my name is Ralph Campbell. I'm here in sunny South Florida. So I'm from South Florida. I'm a performance and learning coach. And so I coach men and women for a living. I've been doing that on and off for the past 25 years. My favorite subject in high school, band. I loved band. I loved band. I loved acting class. And my least favorite in high school, chemistry. I didn't like chemistry.
Awesome. Mr. J, you're up next, man. Same format. Introduction, where you're located, a little bit about what you do, and favorite and least favorite subjects in high school.
Yeah, again, well, thank you, Julia and Daniel, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. As far as what I do professionally, it's a combination of corporate training, primarily focused on leadership development. I do a lot of individual coaching, executive coaching. I will consult with different organizations based on what their needs are, and I also just do some public speaking. And in terms of my favorite high school class and my least favorite high school subject, that's a tough question. It was so long ago. I'm gonna have to really think about it. My first thought when I thought of the least favorite, it had to be home economics. That's not my thing, and we were forced to take it just so we learned a little bit about what it's like to have a home, or create a home and take care of a home. Probably my most favorite though would be math, only because I was really good at it, but I really enjoyed social studies as well. Different social studies topics, which when I was a teacher, I was a high school teacher over 20 years ago, that's what I taught, social studies.
Awesome. So, and nobody asked, but art was my favorite and math was the one I got in the most trouble with. Moving right along, in your current professional role, what do you do? Each of you kind of spoke to that a little bit. And is it something that you imagine doing when you were in high school? Like, Jay, you were a teacher and then you got into leadership and professional development.
Yeah, actually, I started off in leadership development, but that's not what I went to school for. Actually, when I was younger, when I was little, I wanted to be a Navy pilot. Partially because I have family from the DC area and family who lived in Annapolis. And when I was little, I visited the Naval Academy, and that influenced me a lot. And so that's what I imagined doing. And then I got interested in engineering. And when I started college, my first major was engineering, and I failed miserably. Talk about an experience of failure. I actually failed out of school. I got kicked out of college for bad grades.
Wow.
Because engineering was not meant for me. Although I was good in math, I couldn't handle the science. I couldn't handle the physics and analytical geometry. So I completely I took a semester off and returned to community college for business, and I excelled. So when I shifted my major, I did really well. And so but I never imagined being in business or being a leadership trainer, coach. I never thought about anything like that when I was young.
Ralph, how about yourself, man? Did you have the foresight to believe that you'd be here when you were, let's say, the age of a lot of our students that are on today?
Great question. I grew up in Key West, Florida, the southernmost tip of the United States of America. And we grew up, we didn't really have a lot. And so I didn't really like school. But I had a teacher who fell in love with me, and he taught me the growth mindset that I could be anybody I wanted to become. And so starting off, I wanted to be a stockbroker, money, money, money. And when I went to college, I started learning about, what's my purpose and what's my why in life. And I began to explore different avenues. And so I spent 20 plus years in the sales business. And then I started starting a few companies in the area of personal development. Really, I wanted to find out more about myself and understand why I did certain things. And I started being very interested in human behavior over 25, 26 years ago. And that's led me on this course. As I began to manage people in some of my professional careers, it was always about how can I make people better? How can I make people better around me so that we can have a better world that we live in? And that's really fast forward to what I do today. I work with young people and young adults and adults on supporting them getting from where they are to where they want to be, and letting them know that we're all born with dignity, our inherent value and worth. And when we uphold each other's dignity, we have a world that works for everybody. And so I'm excited to do what I do because it's not work. There's good work, Daniel, and there's great work. Good work is when you go to work and you work hard, and it's a hard day's work. And great work is you're doing meaningful work and you're making an impact. And so I like to say that I do great work.
I love that too, because I think I heard you say about the why a couple of times. It always makes, when people say that, it always makes me think of Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, right? And I know that is not something that we talk enough about, but hopefully it is something that over the summer, some of our students get an opportunity to kind of look into what that really means, because I think through life, you struggle to find your why first. And once you find the why, you discover purpose, and then everything else kind of falls into place. Jay, you spoke a little bit about your biggest failure. Ralph, you did not share that story with us. So what would you say is one of your biggest wins and also one of your biggest failures?
Well, let's start with the biggest win first, because I want to get the dopamine hit, right? The biggest win. I applied for a leadership program, and some of the young leaders today can relate to this. I wanted to be a part of this leadership program in Florida. It's a statewide program, and 5,000 people apply every year, and they only take 58. And so my biggest win professionally, I got in the program, and I was surprised. I had imposter syndrome. And for those of you who don't, imposter syndrome, you don't really think you belong. So I kind of had that going on, and I actually got in. And that was about 11 years ago. So that was a really big victory for me as far as self-esteem and me belonging in this community environment. Now, my biggest failure, I was a know-it-all. You couldn't tell me anything in my 20s, Daniel. I knew everything. So I started a business when I was 28. I'm an entrepreneur. I had very little skill sets. I was a horrible listener. I was egotistical, and I didn't have a mentor. So guess what? 8 months later, the business crashed. 0 clients. Humility, self-esteem, all the life lessons that my parents and people around me were telling me, I wasn't listening. And so my biggest failure was at 28 years old, I left my corporate job. I invested $30,000 in a business, and in 6 months I was broke.
Wow.
So that's my biggest failure. And I'm so excited I failed, because look at me now.
Wow. That there was a lesson that you got out of that. Now, Jay, I'm not going to have you relive any of the traumatic experiences of your biggest failure, but you did not share with us your biggest win to date. So I'd like to give you that opportunity.
Yeah. Also, my example of the biggest failure was educational. It wasn't business, oriented. I've had a bunch of those as well. So being fired from jobs because I wasn't a fit for the job. I was a teacher, like I mentioned, and just to quickly, share a professional failure. I had a situation in which, when I was a teacher, I taught critical thinking in philosophy and world religions. And when I taught critical thinking, I one time did a class that was a debate, sort of a debate class. And the way that I did the debate class, it had to do with legislation in the government. This is back in the mid 90s, to put it in some context. Legislation that was that failed to provide equal rights to homosexuals in the workplace. And I thought that'd be a great topic to debate for my, mostly sophomores and juniors that I had in this class. Anyway, it blew up in my face, and I got reprimanded by the principal. And when I got reprimanded by the principal, I basically succumbed to the way in which educational organizations and education just in general can be somewhat constrictive. So I didn't really take a stand the way that I could have taken a stand. Long story short, I taught for 5 years. I didn't teach for as long as I could have taught if I would have had, taken it on in a different way. So to me, that was one of my biggest failures, just in that I didn't respond to it the way that I could have, right? In retrospect, I would have been a different person in that situation than I was. Now, the good news about it is that it freed me up to go out and create and innovate. Because when I left, that was my last real job, quote unquote job, was when I was a teacher. That was 20 plus years ago. And so on the upside, it's allowed me to really force myself to innovate. And so my greatest success, I would say professionally, has been creating a coaching certification program about 5 years ago. I went through, it was a year and a half long process. I had to put together a 130-page application to a third-party accreditation body called the Certified Coaches Alliance. And I did all this, and it was a tremendous project. A lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of creativity, a lot of feedback, a lot of trial and error. So that would be what I would say would be my greatest success so far.
Awesome. So you actually did the Phoenix move, where you took the ashes of something that you thought was a failure and you created something amazing out of that.
Yeah, I didn't realize it at the time that it was, the kind of failure that it was. It was just upsetting, right? It was just an emotional difficulty. But looking back at it, I reflect on it differently now than I did then, and I use it as a source of inspiration.
Wow. So if I'm not mistaken, gentlemen, you have a presentation. So do you want to do the presentation first and then kind of go into the questions based on what the students come up with after that?
Sure. Jay will pull it up. And as Julia spoke of earlier, we want this to be a dialogue. So we're here to hear from you. We want to hear your voice. We want to create and add value for you. So we're going to just pull up a few slides and have a conversation, Daniel, and then open the floor up for the students to ask questions or participate, if that works.
That works for us. If it works for you, if you like it, we love it.
All right, so this
where I heard that. I feel like I heard that in a rap song somewhere, and then that just got stuck in my head.
You did.
So this is going to be an abbreviated version of. We actually do a course with this title that it's an hour to hour and 15-minute long course. We've done it a couple of different times virtually here for clients of ours. So we'll just give you some of the highlights of what we talk about, because the topic is a pretty big topic, right? Stress, anxiety, difficulty, uncertainty in the world today. Obviously, that's relevant given the global pandemic we're all having to deal with. So there's a heightened sense of anxiety, or at least potential anxiety, and certainly potential uncertainty. A lot of teenagers these days were pulled out of school early. If you're a senior, you obviously have dealt with the difficulty of not graduating in a traditional way, and that might be stressful, or maybe still is stressful. So, the topic we thought was particularly relevant given what's going on. But what we like to do is step back just for a moment and talk from a philosophical or psychological standpoint about how do we define stress, or how do we define something like anxiety. And just as a quick caveat, neither Ralph or I are licensed therapists. We're not psychologists. We're not psychiatrists. So we're not talking about the type of anxiety that you would go to see a professional about. In other words, we're talking about the relatively normal levels of stress that we all deal with, and different uncertainties that can be anxious that we all deal with in various ways, right? So what yours is personally might not be the same as what mine is, or what Ralph's is, or what anybody else's is, but you can understand that as human beings, we all have some degree of relative stress and anxiety in the world, living in the world. So the significant versions of that require some professional help, that's a whole different class. That's not something we're qualified to teach, okay? Now, we're going to use just as a framework what's called the support challenge model, which comes from Maslow, a very well-known psychologist from decades ago. And what he basically said in this model is that how you determine whether or not you experience stress or other emotions has something to do with two criteria. The first criteria being the level of challenge that you perceive you're facing, and the second criteria is the level of support that you perceive you have in relation to that challenge. And it's the combination of these two criteria, challenge and support, that you perceive that determine where you are emotionally. So the first one Let's see. Oh, there we go. The first one is what we call boredom, which is where you perceive that you're not being challenged really at all, very low level of challenge, while at the same time perceiving that there's not much support around either. And the combination of those two leads to experiences of feeling kind of isolated or just disinterested, not really engaged, right? And then if you go up the challenge spectrum, as you increase challenge but don't increase support, you'll eventually experience stress. In other words, you're being asked to do something, or you're being put in a situation that's not inherently easy. It's inherently challenging or difficult, but you don't recognize where the support exists to help you with that challenge. And that could lead to fear, anxiety, various forms of physical or emotional dis-ease. And then the next one would be the opposite of that. You experience a lot of support. In other words, you have a lot available to you, a lot of resources, a lot of people willing to contribute, but you're not being challenged. You're not being put in situations that call you forth in some new way. And so eventually you become lazy, or what we title here is apathetic, right? Sometimes there's what's associated with that, or a sense of entitlement, right? Like you're supposed to be given all the things that you need without having to really work for it necessarily. And then the highest level of the 4 quadrants in this model. Oh, and one other thing, that these three quadrants, we'll call them, are various forms of what could become a comfort zone. Even stress, although by definition would be uncomfortable, some people get so used to being in stressful states that that's actually a type of comfort zone for them. They get very familiar with it. They almost rely upon experiencing heightened levels of stress. So how that occurs is an individual process, but that it occurs is something to be aware of. And then the 4th quadrant, where you ideally want to be, and where there's more of an association with developing yourself and growing and accomplishing what you want to accomplish in life. It's this state called learning. It's heightened self-awareness. It's what's associated with having a growth mindset and an open mindset and a promotion mindset. And it comes with elements of cooperation, being on a team, working in a collaborative way with people, utilizing and recognizing strengths, and everybody's playing their part and doing their best and offering something of value. But definitionally, it's really where you are challenged in the right way and the right amounts, but you also recognize where the support exists to help you with that challenge. And you're in a state of ongoing perpetual development and growth and learning. And that's where you ideally want to be, especially when you are an entrepreneur in the world. You want to recognize when you're in one of the other categories, and be aware that you can move yourself out of the other ones into a more conscious state of learning. That's part of the goal. Okay, so having said that, do we have space to take any questions on that, Daniel, or?
Absolutely, man. You're running the show. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I do what I can to kind of give you a little bit of assistance as necessary. There is a quick poll.
I see it.
So if the students get an opportunity. And I think it's important, I think that this is kind of that time to have this discussion as we're coming to the end of the school year, but everything is so uncertain. And I can't think of a time in my lifetime that things have been this uncertain at such a large level.
Yeah.
I can't speak for anyone older than me, but I can definitely, anyone behind me can probably say the same thing.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to let it go another couple of seconds. All right, I think I can share them. Does everybody see it?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so that might be just helpful context.
Thank you.
So it's about 80%. It's either at least a bit more stress and anxiety, or a lot more stress, right? So the vast majority, you're experiencing more stress than you maybe anticipated as a response to what we're dealing with the pandemic. So for those of you who that's true, where you have experienced more stress than what you would want or what is, you know, ideal for you, the next question to ask yourself would be, well, how do I define specifically what the challenge is that I'm facing or that's being, you know, put upon me? What are the challenges? And then secondarily, where are the uh, elements of support? What maybe that I haven't recognized yet? You know, like it could be specific people in your life who you just haven't talked to about the stress yet or about the challenge yet. And if you were to have conversations, you might recognize that there are opportunities to get support from those individuals that you haven't previously recognized. There are all kinds of other methodologies, though, when it comes to dealing with stress, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But it does help to kind of define the elements that make up what you perceive as actual experiences of stress.
Yes, and Daniel, we'll provide you the slide deck because I think that slide that Jay just went over, those 4 quadrants, that's a really good piece for every human being to have because all of us operate every day, depending on the situation. We're jumping between quadrants, and people that are obviously able to manage stress and their emotions at a higher level, they'll tend to be in the green quadrant. But I want to mention one thing about stress, and we know in many contexts stress is uncomfortable, it's not ideal, and as Jay mentioned, you know, if you're so used to stress, you could actually be in a comfort zone. There's 2 types of stress, right? We have the quote unquote not so good stress, and then we have eustress, 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 and that's actually a good stress. And what we know from the brain is that stress is a chemical, it's released, right? But eustress is a good stress. When you wake up in the morning, you release cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And that's actually not a bad, people love coffee, right? But it also gives you energy. And so managing stress can be our distinctive strength and our leverage. Once we understand that it's not always in the negative quadrant, it actually can be in the positive quadrant because stress by itself is a set of hormones, mainly cortisol.
Yeah, and sometimes to Ralph's point, you don't get to the state of learning in Maslow's model there until you go through one of the other places, like including stress. Sometimes you don't know what the challenge is that really is the best challenge for you until it's sort of thrown upon you or thrust upon you, and you don't yet have any opportunity or have any even time to recognize where the support is that exists for you. You have to spend some time investigating that. But while you're doing it, you're stressed because the challenge is there. So it is sometimes a necessary step to get to that quadrant of learning and growth and development and so on.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask actually, because we spoke, I know we've mentioned Maslow a few times. How many of the students here, just by a quick show of hands, either virtually or in the camera, have ever heard of Maslow before?
Just put your thumbs up.
So,
or you can just chat it in.
Or in the chat. Now, if possible, it doesn't seem like there's a huge familiarity with Maslow, but a lot of what he does, a lot of the work he did set the foundation for how we understand so many other things related to business. So can you speak a little bit about Maslow and his impact on what he studied and then how that connects to business?
Yeah, well, what he's most well known for is what's called the hierarchy of needs. And the premise of the hierarchy of needs is that we enter into the world with some basic needs that we can't escape, which begin basically as survival needs. So the need for food and water and shelter, and those are the lower levels of his pyramid of the hierarchy. And so the first part of life is just addressing those. And then as we grow and develop, it becomes more subjective, it becomes more risky, it becomes less guaranteed. So needs like love and belongingness, needs like fitting in, being a part of a group, having an identity. And then you get to the very top of his pyramid, and it's what he calls self-actualization. And that is the pinnacle of being the sort of the best version of yourself, operating within your greatest potential. So that includes finding the career avenue or path that's the best fit for you, where you can access your talents, and you can be challenged, and you can be empowered, and you can be creative, and you can work well on teams. And what that is for you, you may not know until you're thrown into a situation unexpectedly. So again, there might be some stress along the way, but when you are operating optimally, it's what Maslow would identify as, or how he defines self-actualization. You're being self-actualized because you're connecting to what's truly possible for you.
And I love the fact that you said that, because it truly does tie back to what Ralph said earlier about doing great work, right? Like, as you understand who you are, you start to take on things that have more purpose and leave you feeling as if you had an impact. And I think for a lot of students, the question that we always ask is, what do you want to be? But we never ask who they want to be when they grow up. How do you feel about the difference? It's a small difference, but it makes a huge distinction with those questions.
Yeah, and I would say, to your point earlier about the work of Simon Sinek, is that it's also, the question is also, why does it matter to you so much? Like, why does your business or your enterprise or your project or whatever you're working on, why does it, motivate you? Why does it inspire you? Why does it challenge you? Why does it have you want to get out of bed in the morning? What is it about it that's like helps you better define yourself, right? Or identify your role in society, your role in your community?
And
Yeah.
Ralph, I wanted to just give you a slight wrinkle on that, in just that, tying it back to speaking about anxiety, when you connect to a more powerful why, do you find that it also helps people manage stress better?
Yeah. And what happens at a subconscious level is that when I'm connected to my why, and my why is to leave a positive mark on people's lives, so that together, the difference we make for each other can never be erased. That's my why. So I wake up every day very clear on my why. And when I'm connected to my why, and what the data tells us, when people are connected to their why, their cause, their purpose, they actually begin to forget themselves. I don't mean forget that I'm wearing a shirt, forget that I had a headset on, that I'm in 12th grade or 11th grade. I mean, forget myself, in that all of my issues and problems and things that I think are so important, weighing me down, they become less and less as important to me. And what becomes more and more important is what I care about, the impact I want to make with my entrepreneurial project, my new business, why I care about my friends and my family, and why going to college or whatever my career track will be, why is that so important to me? And what you'll find is that anxiety and a lot of these social ills, they come from, at times, the self-awareness, the thinking about ourselves so much. It's more internal, that's what the data tells us. And when I let go of me, as Maslow was saying, self-actualization, I let go of me, there's more of me to give for others. It's almost like a paradox. When I stop being me, I'm actually more of me. I love that. Why don't we write that down? When I stop being me, there's more of me to give. And your students, when they're excelling, I judged a week and a half ago, I believe, I was amazed by what I saw. And all I thought was, they're presenting less of them and more about other people and their project and this business. It was never on them, besides their name and the high school. It was, how can we contribute and make a difference? And I didn't hear stress in the videos they made. I didn't hear being hijacked. We'll get into that in a minute. I didn't hear anxiety. What I heard is excitement, commitment, focus, and people that really cared about making a difference.
Jay, I don't want to get off of that if you had some insight you wanted to share, because I know I switched the question a little bit.
What Ralph just talked about reminds me a little bit about we do a course on listening, and there's what's known as the levels of listening. And at the highest levels of listening, what actually happens is you disappear. You forget that you're there. You don't have your filters in place. You're not trying to, understand how what's being communicated to you makes sense in your world. You're fully over, in the shoes of someone else, and all about what's going on for them, and doing your best to appreciate and empathize and connect with and come together with other people, or whatever the message is. It's sort of like, I often use the example of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And when he made that speech, he wasn't making it about him. It wasn't about his own dream and vision. It was a vision for anybody and everybody. And so that's why long after he was gone, the vision is still alive. And it's a contextual thing. And so, what that idea that when you're coming from pure vision and it's real for you, it's really not about you, the individual. It becomes about the vision. And so you reinvent yourself or go through the difficulties that are inevitable, the challenges that are inevitable, but how you engage just changes when that why is so big and so real.
Awesome. And we did have a question in the chat from Miss Brown, who was wondering, when you relate Maslow's concepts to sales and business, how can you relate Maslow's concepts to sales and business, particularly when we talk about the uncertainty that has come along with this whole pandemic situation?
That's a big question. So my first thought is that I would ask you, does your product or does your service, whatever you're selling, help your customers get closer to their pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Does it help them become self-actualized in some way? Does it serve some recognizable purpose that has some recognizable value? And if it does, then it's going to be more of a natural, the selling that, whatever that is going to be easier and more natural for you, because it's probably going to be aligned towards your higher level of self-actualization.
Ralph, you've got a career in sales before you got into empowering others, man. What did you have to say on that?
I only have a few words. And the few words, given I spent 27 years in sales, money follows value. Money follows value. So all of you who are aspiring to be entrepreneurs and you're interested in an entrepreneurial mindset, or you wouldn't be a part of NFTE, and you are maybe going to be thinking of doing businesses in the future, the value you create for others will generate your abundance. And the value you create for others takes you and the customer up the pyramid to the highest level of self-actualization. And I don't want to get too philosophical, but before Maslow died, he began to write about the next step above self-actualization. And what's that? Self-transcendence. Thinking less of me, being more about other people, that there's something bigger than me. And guess as an entrepreneur, what's bigger than me? My customer, the world, the people I'm serving, the entrepreneurial mindset. We can translate of being bigger than my self-actualized self becomes transcendent, like bigger than me, which is the client, the problem I'm solving for.
Wow. I did not even know that there was more than self-actualization. So that throws me a little bit. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Can I just add to that for a moment? It's actually very similar to what Dr. Stephen Covey did when he wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which came out in the late 80s, early 90s. It became really, really popular in the business world. One of the very first books I read, a business book that I found incredibly valuable, was that book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But the 7 habits were all about me and my own success, right? And then 20 years later, he wrote The 8th Habit. And the 8th habit was all about me having other people succeed. Like it's leading other people for them to become leaders. So I associate that with what Maslow was sort of getting at, and that beyond the me, myself, and I self-actualization, maybe that's where it has to begin. I have to take care of myself and challenge myself and design myself and redesign myself. And in that process, I eventually realized it's not about me so much. I can focus on other people until eventually it becomes all about focusing on other people.
Now, how does all of that then tie back to managing anxiety and stress?
Well, when you have an outward view and you're focused out on the needs of others or the needs of your community, then you have a different relationship with your stress automatically. You don't see it the same way. It doesn't capture you or, debilitate you. It doesn't stay the handicap it might have once been. So it's not changing the circumstances or the stimulus that you once experienced stress with. It's just designing a new relationship with that stimulus or those circumstances. Certain things are beyond your control. None of us can control that we're dealing with a pandemic. None of us can control the science behind it, the infection rate, right, or the potential for mortality with certain part of the population. We can't change any of that. What we can do is relate to reality in a variety of different ways. And you may not know how at first. There's no easy answer, especially with something as significant as a global pandemic. But if you're in the question, and if you stay in the question, and you recognize your capacity to invent new ideas and think in new ways about the same information, then you alter your experience.
Yeah, when we work with, and Jason had done a lot of work with young students, and so have I, and we talk about choice and about this ability to make new meaning of things. And this managing stress and anxiety in this uncertain world, and today, obviously the pandemic, it's about what we have in front of us, and it's about who I am in relationship to it. But the key piece to who I am in relationship to it is who's around me, Daniel. Who's my support team around me? Human being by design, Homo sapiens, we are social species. We need each other. We coexist with each other. Anxiety and depression is tied to loneliness. It's tied to people distancing themselves from other people. And so as we go at this, it's who's around you. I talked about someone in high school. I had a teacher that doubled down on me. I didn't believe in myself. He put me in advanced courses. I didn't believe I deserved to be there. Now I failed geometry. Let's be honest. It was hard when I was a ninth grader. I was in over my head. But he said, so what? You're going to make it up in summer school and you're going to be somebody because I believe in you. And he was the first man to double down on me. Tim McShane. I owe him my life today. And he was my support. He was my support. And because of him, I went on to school and here I am today. And it's the idea that I was able to make a different interpretation about myself, about my value, about my worth. Did not come overnight. Because I'm speaking today, don't think this was the shy 16-year-old. Well, I wasn't really shy. Okay. This was the...
I was.
Well, Jay was. I was still very vocal about it, but lacking self-esteem. I was an imposter. I didn't feel comfortable in my skin. But having the support team around me, people and friends, which friends are so important to find, it doesn't mean 40 friends. Find 2 or 3 people that will double down on you, that believe in you. And you really can grow from there and have a different relationship to what we call this uncertain world in uncertain times.
Wow. I feel like you wanted to say something, Jay.
Well, I was just going to ask you how much time we have because Ralph and I had something in mind we wanted to show that would sort of answer the question about stress and anxiety on the extreme version. And if you can deal with it on the extreme version, then you can handle it on the sort of the moderate version, right? For some people, what we've been dealing with the past couple of months has been it's been kind of extreme. So more on the extreme side. So do we have maybe at least 10 more minutes or so?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. So what am I going to do next? I'm going to show you a video. And I want you to just to watch the video and listen to the video. And as you're watching and listening to it, just notice your experience you're having in the moment. So we're going to induce for you a fear-oriented or anxious type of experience, and then we'll talk about it. It's okay. Everybody will live. You'll survive. But just notice what happens for you when you're watching this and listening to this.
More than 65% of India's population lives without indoor sanitation. Heading into the night, barefoot, to answer the call of nature is the norm in rural areas and one of the most common causes of snake encounters. Using the figures from the new report and his own decades of field experience, Rom estimates that the Russell's viper could be responsible for half of all fatalities. Many occur in circumstances just like this.
Okay, let's have the main light on.
All right. So just notice, right, just now when you watch this, what experience did you have? What did it evoke in you? If you had any, nervousness or fear or anxiety or, oh my God, like you're putting yourself in that person's situation, right? What would that be like? For some people have a tremendous fear of snakes or just, any kind of, you're raising your hand, Daniel, any kind of potentially threatening other, life form, animal form. So what this is an example of is what is known as an amygdala hijack. And you may have heard of the term amygdala hijack before. It looks like this. I've taken this picture from the book written by Daniel Goleman, who is really the one who coined the phrase emotional hijack. He wrote the book called Emotional Intelligence. And it came out in 1995, and it was the #1 best-selling book of the entire decade of the 90s. Because what he was talking about was so revolutionary in terms of understanding success. He did a lot of research in the business world, the corporate world, to determine how people who are successful, leaders in organizations, how they become successful. And what he learned was that they become successful by developing not just competency that's technical or subject matter oriented, they develop emotional competency, people skills, right? It's what he calls emotional intelligence. And one of the challenges to emotional intelligence is some of how we're hardwired in our brain to deal with what we perceive as threats, which induces stress. So the extreme version of it is when you have what's called a flight or fight or freeze response. You perceive something as threatening and you automatically freeze up, or you want to fight what you perceive as a threat, or you run away. And you don't control this response. It happens automatically beyond your control. It's a very conditioned response based on your brain. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala that is responsible for these automatic choices you make, which is why sometimes you'll say things to someone, they say something to you, and you'll say something back as a pushback, and then a little bit later you regret it. You're like, why did I say that? I didn't really mean that. That's an example of an emotional hijack happening. So if you can practice recognizing this version of stress and anxiety, when this occurs, you automatically increase your capacity to deal with it when it's not so extreme. So to better appreciate what we're talking about here in terms of managing emotional hijack situations, there are ways you can identify it. There are 3 basic signs to it. First, it's a strong emotional reaction. Like it's a heightened reaction, more so than you normally would emotionally. It happens right away. It happens quickly. It doesn't typically last very long, but also it's associated with somewhat of a regret afterward. And when that is part of what happens, you've been hijacked. And when you can catch this, at least in retrospect, catch it, you can deal with it in healthier ways. Now, let me give you a way to maybe rethink or re-experience the video I just showed you. So I'm going to show you the rest of it. And so you can hear and see what was really going on here.
Okay.
It's such accidental interactions between people and snakes that are at the heart of the problem. And Rom has devised an experiment to analyze exactly what's going on.
You notice the foot.
What we're doing here is replicating what could be a very common occurrence. Someone walking around at night accidentally steps on a snake, in this case a Russell's viper, and gets nailed. But what's really special about...
All right, so now that you have the additional information, right, that what was actually occurring was not a real person stepping on a real snake, getting bitten by the snake, you have a different experience. If you would have known that when you first watched the first part of the video, you wouldn't have probably had the emotional reaction you had because you had additional information. So the reality is when you get hijacked in some way, or you're dealing with a heightened level of stress or anxiety, what is probably happening, almost a guarantee, is that you're just not seeing some information, not aware of something that if you were to become aware of it would alter how you're experiencing that situation. It would lessen the stress. It would lessen the anxiety. So one of the solutions is to just remember this and ask yourself better questions. Ask yourself, what is it that I'm not aware of that if I knew it would actually give me some perspective about this? If I could ask 5 questions, or I could ask just 2 questions that would give me a chance to see this differently and potentially experience this differently, what would that be?
Yeah, and if I could just add, human beings, there's a bias called the impact bias. And the impact bias says that as humans, we tend to over-exaggerate events in their duration and their intensity before they even happen, or in the moment they happen. We make up this story. And what happens is oftentimes it's never as intense and it's never as long. If you think about the pandemic, you think about things that are going on in your business, new careers. Am I going to make it? This snake, if I had more information. There's a professor in the 70s, she created this school, and she created this this way of thinking called habits of mind. And she talked about having a school where the school was full of questions. And they studied this school, and these kids did better than the traditional schools in Harlem, a very poor community. We're going back in the 70s and the 80s. And she had the children and the youth begin to learn how to ask questions. She called it the habits of mind. And when they had a situation, she said, ask a set of questions. How do I know what's true or false? What evidence counts? What if I looked at this from a different direction? Why does this matter? What if this were different? It's called the habits of mind. You can Google it. And it's a way of thinking about things in the world through questions. Another way to mitigate stress. Another way to manage in a world of uncertainty. Another way of seeing a snake that's no longer a threat, but a reward.
Wow.
To put it in a visual picture here, here's what we ask this question whenever we teach the longer version of this class, and it's done via a poll. And what always happens when we ask this question is the respondents, sometimes we do this for 100 people. The vast majority will select number 1 on this list, conversations with others. And it's not just conversations to share what I'm experiencing, what my anxiety is about, what my stress is about. It's really what Ralph is talking about. It's asking better questions to find out more, to learn more, to uncover, right? To explore, to discover. And the process alone of being able to have conversations about what you're stressing out about, what you're anxious about, what you're uncertain about, that alone has an incredibly positive effect, especially if you choose someone to talk to who you really trust. Someone who you know is going to listen, someone who you know is not going to just judge you on the surface, but really going to be curious, be inquisitive. So it makes a difference to choose well who you have these conversations with. But you can also see there's a lot of other opportunity to do things and to practice different methodologies for managing your own individual experiences of stress or various types of anxiety. So none of these are better than others. It depends on what works for you. I personally, one that works really well for me is meditation, mindful meditation. It's something I do almost every day, sometimes more than once a day, because it has me remember not to get so attached to what's going on in my mind and reconnect with what's actually going on physically in my body and disassociate the two.
We have a few minutes. Maybe people, maybe they want to chat or put in the chat room. What do they most identify with? What are the common methods they use to manage stress and anxiety? There's many others that we haven't mentioned that they want to share about.
I think it's important to make sure we contextualize this conversation with the fact that young people are under a lot more stress than has been recognized previously. And so it's important that we're not just having this conversation. But hopefully this also helps us to create opportunities for them to be able to express to people that they trust, but also that we probably need to do a better job of listening to them as well.
Yeah.
Good point.
Absolutely.
Great point.
That's actually related to our next slide here. So, you know, this is being recorded, as Ralph said. You can have these slides. You can send them out to your participants here, or anybody you want to send it to. But one last, I think, important takeaway is, if there was a what to do sort of process, this is what we recommend generally as a what to do. And this is, as you see, if you look at the right, it's associated with generally developing greater emotional intelligence. You know, first, understanding that emotional intelligence is itself a long-term process that leads to greater overall general success in life, regardless of what kind of profession you move yourself towards or what you're really interested in life. Having emotional intelligence just is going to have you be better in all of the relationships that are tied to whatever you're doing professionally or whatever you're doing personally. So in times of stress or anxiety or difficulty, just practicing these simple things, it can go a long way. And a lot of this, as you can see, has to do with the quality of your communication, the quality of what you say to yourself, the quality of what you say out loud to other people, things like naming your emotion when you're upset, not evaluating the emotion, just saying, this is how I feel. Sometimes that goes a long way just to kind of alleviate its grip, you know?
I wanted to insert, because we had a couple of students give the way I framed it was, when you're stressed out, what do you do to relieve that? So what's kind of your instant thing that you do? We got from one student, distractions and food, those were kind of the two that resonated with her the most. We also got either praying or sleeping.
Yeah.
As a response. And then another one that I guess I would classify, though Dylan, correct me if I'm wrong, as kind of distraction, is just finding something to take your mind off of it. So just trying to find something else to refocus on.
I know we're coming to our time. I want to be respectful, Daniel, of the participants. And Jay's last slide was obviously a way to come in recognition of the emotion and ways that you can understand the emotion, manage the emotion, and work through that process. And I would say what underpins it all is do it with a group of people. Do it with the power of one. Do it with someone. We talk a lot about reaching out for help, and oftentimes the data tells us people aren't doing that. And the reason they're not doing that, Daniel, the data says is that people don't feel safe. Just like the snake. If I don't feel safe, I'm emotionally hijacked. You're telling me to reach out for support, but I think you're the snake. And so I tell young people, I tell people that I coach, find somebody, share what's going on with you, ask for help, psychological safety, thank you, ask for support. You don't have to do it on a forum on Zoom and LinkedIn and Instagram and TikTok and stop. You can do it. I'm not making that wrong. I'm letting you know there's people out here like me, Jay. It's people like Julia and Daniel. You can do it in whatever forum. And just know that only you make the difference that you make. And that there's people out here that care about you, because you're our future. You're going to be taking care of me. So I have to make sure I'm serving you. So when you're emotionally hijacked, you can get back to where you need to be sooner than later.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you took it there, because I was going to ask for final thoughts to kind of take this all back home. And I think you did a great job of answering the question that I hadn't asked yet. Jay, same thing. Final thoughts on working with everything that we've discussed, some of the tactics and insights that you've provided, and what do you want our students to take from this discussion?
I think for me, the biggest thing is hearing everything we've been talking about as a way to redefine your relationship with failure or relative failure, because sometimes I think there's an automatic interpretation that when I'm anxious or I'm stressed or I'm upset or I'm, just not emotionally in a good place, there's something wrong with me, or that is sort of an expression of there's something like I'm failing as a person, and that's just not true. In fact, you know, there's a lot of research that says sort of the opposite, that the most successful people in life, generally the ones who accomplish the most in life, they experience more failure and they experience more stress because they put themselves in situations that are more challenging, right? That are just, they're not easy by automatically. You have to do something new or you have to reinvent yourself in some new way. So just remember that if you're stressed or anxious or having a difficult time, that's perfectly normal. But you also, to Ralph's point, have a lot of options and a lot of choices to manage it better. And it begins with your relationships, including your relationship with yourself. What do you say to yourself about yourself? And what you say to yourself about yourself leads to everything else that comes next. What you say to someone else about them, what you say to someone else about yourself as well. So you have a lot of opportunity to practice the stuff we're talking about, but just know it's not going to be, you're never going to get to a place where you're completely free of stress and anxiety or difficulties or challenges, especially if you're an entrepreneur in the world and you're trying something new that no one else is doing. You're inviting stress and a bit of anxiety. You're inviting some failure. It's part of the deal.
Awesome. Gentlemen, I do appreciate you. Thank you so very much. I think this was a timely and very relevant topic to kind of end this series on. So we do appreciate some time and sharing your expertise and insights with us. For the students from the Southeast,